The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and Radio Canada announced this week that it is cutting 10% of the workforce and will axe some programming to cope with the potential $125 million budget shortfall. Joining me to discuss this is Marla Boltman, Executive Director, Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. Marla, thanks for doing this today.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me.
All right. So what are your thoughts, I guess, in general on this?
Well, I mean, as we told the media when we first heard, we think these layoffs are going to deal a heavy and unnecessary blow to CBC. And I say heavy because we're talking about, massive job losses at a time when Canadians are really already struggling with the cost of living. I say heavy because some of these losses are coming to Canadian programming in both French and English at a time when audiences are already being drowned out by a tsunami of Hollywood content. CBC, as we all know, is the only Canadian broadcaster mandated to provide Canadians with programming that reflects, our country and our perspectives. And I think a lot of us feel we really need more Canadian content from the CBC, not less. And these cuts are going to affect that. And, finally, I say heavy because if these cuts are in journalism, which we have not yet, there's been no determination yet how many of these jobs could be in journalism. What we really risk is the news deserts that we've seen in print news media. Mm-hmm. We risk seeing them in broadcast news media with further cuts in journalism. And we know in some areas of Canada, particularly in the smaller markets, CBC is one of, if not the only source of local and regional news. So this is pretty terrifying. And then, just to add to that, I say unnecessary, and I think this is really the kicker for Canadians, is the government promised to provide the CBC with $400 million during the last election. And while they saw a little bit of money during COVID to cover inflation and declining ad revenues, it was nothing close to the $400 million that was promised. And what a lot of Canadians may not know, because this was sort of quietly mentioned in the spring budget, the Liberals are calling for Crown corporations to cut their budgets by 3.33% in the coming fiscal year. And so that cut is in part prompted the announcement of these layoffs. And so when you factor all those things together, it kind of feels like the CBC is being kicked when it's down. And we're concerned that it just makes it more vulnerable to attack.
All right. Catherine Tate, the president of CBC Radio Canada, says that she hopes Canadians won't notice too much. Quote, journalism is core, and wherever possible, we are trying to protect those positions. What's your response to that?
Well, we certainly hope that's the case. I think we've all seen what's happening in the news media ecosystem, and that, as we lose credible and reliable sources of news, of which CBC is one of them, we run the risk of those news holes being replaced with misinformation and disinformation and rumors and special interest groups. So our hope absolutely is that journalism won't be touched. In fact, I'm in Ottawa right now. We were just here appearing before the CRTC on the implementation of Bill C-11, which is the Online Streaming Act. And one of the reasons why Friends is here was to defend news, particularly local news, and where we want to see contributions coming from that new bill going towards that. So we certainly hope that CBC will also follow suit and not make cuts in the newsrooms.
All right. So how many people are watching CBC, though, right now? Because from what I can gather, the numbers aren't good.
I can't speak to the audience data. I can tell you that at Friends, we engage with over 360,000 supporters who are very strong supporters of the CBC. We acknowledge that the CBC is having challenges, and it's one of the reasons why we've been calling for what we would call a mandate review for quite a long time now. We think that, the CBC to many people is still a beloved and absolutely necessary public media institution, and it fulfills a lot of, really essential needs for Canadians. But like anything, there's a time for a check-in, a check-up, to see how things are doing and to see how things can be made better. And we think that we should be having those conversations about the CBC, about its mandate, and how it can be the best it can be for Canadians.
All right, there's concerns that on the CBC network. I mean, I only watch, in full honesty, their news network. I don't watch the regular channel station at all. But from what I hear, there's concern that there's American programming on there, and they're competing for revenue dollars when it comes to advertising dollars. And there's this concern that what is the CBC? What is its mandate? And perhaps that needs to be examined, and you alluded to this already, and streamlined. What are your thoughts on some of this?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think all public broadcast, like, I think actually let's take a step back. So I think it's very important that Canadians understand the sort of financial position that the CBC is in, because that speaks directly to what you're talking about, which is programming, how they attract advertising dollars, why they're attracting advertising dollars in the first place, because then they're competing with the private market. So I just want to give you some stats, because I think it's really important, and I think people need to know the actual facts on this, okay?
Sure.
So in constant dollars, funding on a per capita basis for the CBC has not been this low since 1961. Canada ranks 17th out of 20 Western countries in terms of funding for its national public broadcaster. Mm-hmm. And we already know that there are studies out there now saying that well-funded public broadcasters have stronger democracies. So what does that say? Well, we are 17th out of 20 in terms of funding for our national public broadcaster. So when you break down the parliamentary appropriation that CBC currently receives, it amounts to $33 per person per year. Mm-hmm. That's a dime a day. Mm-hmm. And on that dime a day, every single Canadian across the entire country has free access to global, regional, local news, plus current affairs, arts, culture, education, music, sports programming in multiple languages and multiple platforms. So that speaks to the important role that the CBC plays. The problem is, how do they pay for all of that? And that's where the advertising comes in. So obviously, in a perfect world, our desire to have a public broadcaster that's truly public would leave us with no need for advertising. But the parliamentary appropriation does not support CBC in that way. And so they are forced to rely on advertising and subscription revenues. So for now, we have to tolerate those ads until those dollars come in. So really, it does get back to a question of mandate, as you suggested, which is, do we or do we not want a public broadcaster in Canada? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is yes, then we have to secure fuller and sustainable funding that will allow us to sort of set aside these questions of advertising and foreign programming and things like that. And so that, CBC is no longer forced to rely on advertising, and it can function on the sort of central issues of CBC being underfunded. How do we get back to the CBC that sort of Canadians have known and loved for decades and decades and decades? And how do we fund that CBC? And that comes back to this question of mandate. What does CBC need to look like going forward? All
right. And of course, Pierre Poilievre, and there's a lot of concern for those who support the CBC as to what might happen if, in fact, he forms a majority government, which right now the polling indicates is a real possibility. What's your take on Poilievre?
I think people need to take Poilievre seriously. I think he does intend to dismantle the CBC. I think it's interesting that he intends to do so, and he has not explained to Canadians how he intends to do so, because in courting the love of Quebec, he's talking about preserving Radio-Canada, which is completely intertwined with CBC, and the two cannot be separated. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear how he plans on doing that, and also how he can possibly tell certain regions of Canada that he's going to tear down English CBC, but expect them to fund French CBC. So I'd like to hear a bit less rhetoric and a bit more answers about how this would all happen. But I think Canadians do need to take him seriously. In the past, we've had a lot of leaders who have threatened to, reduce funding for CBC. They have not gone as far as Poilievre has gone. And in the end, they have come around, and it's not become a ballot issue. But as far as we can see right now, this is one of his top fundraising messages, is defunding the CBC. But I think it's also, a question of, is this sort of part of the, I hate to say it, but the right-wing totem for the dismantling of public media institutions? Because it's sort of right out of the playbook that calls for targeting public media in Western democracies. And, we ask, are they doing it because, public media holds these leaders to account and holds them, and they ask them tough questions. Mm-hmm. And when certain politicians don't like the questions, it's easier for them to accuse the media of being biased than to actually provide Canadians with an answer. And that, those accusations of bias seem to form the foundation of the Defund the CBC campaign and all the rhetoric that's coming with it.
All right, quickly, we're just about out of time, but would you say it's safe to say that this is the most precarious moment in time for CBC?
I would say it is one of the most precarious, if not the most precarious. And Friends is working very hard and will continue to work hard as we move into the election to help Canadians understand the value of CBC, understand the value of public broadcasting and the important role it plays in upholding our democracy. And given all the misinformation that we're seeing in the world today, it's really important that we have, Canadian perspectives, Canadian voices, and credible, trusted journalism that we can rely on. And CBC is the source of that, and we need to protect it. We need to uphold it, and we really think it's an important thing for Canadians to be paying attention to and to be getting the facts and not just going to one source of information, but getting the facts about what's really going on at CBC and what people who are trying to tear it down are doing and where that information is coming from. And we, again, encourage them to get the facts.
Okay. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Marla.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care. Marla Boltman, Executive Director, Friends of Canadian Broadcasting.